Good evening, and welcome back to Quiet History. Tonight we're taking you on a journey through one of the greatest stories ever told, the complete story of Greek mythology. From the very beginning, before the gods, before the earth, before anything existed at all. Get comfortable, turn the lights down low. This is going to be a long and beautiful night. In the beginning, there was no Olympus, no earth, no sea, no sky. There was only chaos, a vast, endless darkness older than time itself. And from that darkness, everything was born.
There was, before all things, a condition that the ancient Greeks named chaos, and the naming itself was an act of extraordinary courage, because to name something is to suggest it can be known, and this could not be known. It could only be approached the way one approaches the edge of something that has no edge, the way one listens for a sound that predates the existence of ears. Chaos, as Hesiod understood it in the Theogony, that oldest and most authoritative of Greek cosmological texts, was not darkness. Darkness implies the prior existence of light, and light had not yet been conceived. It was not silence, because silence implies the memory of sound. It was not emptiness in the way a vessel is empty, because a vessel has walls, and walls imply architecture, and architecture implies intention, and intention implies a mind, and no mind yet existed to hold such a thought. Chaos was something older and stranger than any of these conditions. It was the gap itself. The Greek word carries the sense of a yawning, an opening, an abyss that is not a place, but a potential for place. The texture of this primordial state resists description by design. It was neither warm nor cold, because temperature requires matter, and matter had not yet organized itself into the discrete, bounded things that temperature can describe. It had no direction, no up, no down, no horizontal spread of surface, because direction requires a reference point, and there was nothing from which to measure. It churned, perhaps in some sense, older than the word churning, a slow, undifferentiated movement that was neither turbulent nor still. That carried within it the compressed potential of everything that would ever exist, folded into a state so dense with possibility that it registered as nothing at all. From this condition, according to Hesiod, the first presences emerged. They did not arrive as persons. They did not descend from somewhere else or rise from somewhere below. They condensed the way meaning condenses out of a long silence, gradually, and then all at once, and then as though they had always been there. The first of these condensations was Gaia, the earth, though she was not yet the earth in any recognizable sense. She was the principle of horizontal extension, the first suggestion that there could be a surface, a below, a ground against which other things might be measured. Her emergence was not an event so much as a settling, the way sediment settles through still water, finding the lowest available position and resting there, with the patience of something that has no concept of time. Alongside Gaia, or perhaps beneath her, or perhaps in a direction that has no name in any human language, Tartarus made itself known. Tartarus was not a place in the way that places are understood, bounded, mappable, finite. It was the principle of depth itself, the downward pull carried to its ultimate conclusion, the abyss beneath the abyss beneath the abyss, pressing through layer after layer of what would eventually become stone and earth, and the roots of mountains, reaching toward a bottom that receded infinitely before it. Where Gaia was the condition of surface, Tartarus was the condition of what lies beneath all surfaces, the irreducible darkness at the foundation of everything, cold in a way that cold itself had not yet learned to be, silent in a way that made the silence of chaos seem almost musical by comparison. And then, from the same primordial source, something that moved upward rather than downward. Eros, not the small, winged figure of later artistic tradition, not the mischievous deity of romantic poetry, but something far older and more fundamental. The Eros of the theogony was the principle of attraction itself, the force that draws discrete things toward one another, the cosmic impulse that would make creation possible by ensuring that the newly separated elements of the universe would not simply drift apart into permanent isolation. Eros was the reason that matter would eventually organize itself into forms, that forms would eventually seek other forms, that the universe would tend toward complexity rather than dissolution. Without this force, the first stirrings of chaos would have subsided back into undifferentiated nothing. With it, something irreversible had begun. From chaos also came Erebus, a darkness that must be carefully distinguished from the mere absence of light. Erebus was darkness as a substance, as a presence, as a thing with weight and texture, and the capacity to fill space the way water fills a vessel. It settled into the lower regions of the emerging cosmos with the deliberateness of something that knows its place and has always known it. The darkness of Erebus was the darkness of the underworld before the underworld had geography, a primordial obscurity that would eventually become the atmosphere of the realm of the dead, but that, in these earliest moments, was simply the quality of the cosmos below the surface of Gaia, pressing down into the depths where Tartarus waited. With Erebus came Nyx, the night, and here, for the first time, something that might be called a quality of experience entered the cosmos. Nyx was not simply the absence of day, because day did not yet exist. She was the original condition of the sky before sky had learned to carry light. The vast dark canopy that spread above the newly forming surface of Gaia with a kind of terrible beauty, deep, starless, absolute, and yet somehow less oppressive than the chaos from which she had emerged, because she had edges now, a direction, an above and a below. Nyx moved across the surface of the forming world with the unhurried authority of something that has never been challenged and does not yet know that it ever will be. From the union of Erebus and Nyx, that first meeting of underground darkness and sky darkness, that first act of the creative principle that Eros had introduced into the cosmos, came Aether and Hemera. Ether was the upper air, the bright substance that filled the highest regions of the sky above the clouds, a luminous medium that was not yet light, but was the condition in which light would eventually become possible. Hemera was the day, not yet the warm, golden, sun-filled day of later creation, but the first principle of diurnal change, the first suggestion that the cosmos might move in rhythms, that darkness might give way to something else and then return. that time itself might have a structure. These earliest emergences from chaos were not events that could be witnessed because there were no witnesses. They were conditions becoming other conditions, principles differentiating themselves from an original, undifferentiated state. The cosmos learning, slowly, through processes that unfolded across intervals, that make the age of the universe seem brief, to be a cosmos rather than a void. The ancient Greeks who inherited these stories understood this implicitly. Hesiod did not describe the birth of Gaia as a dramatic moment. He described it as a fact. Broad-bosomed Gaia, the ever-sure foundation of all, simply was, having emerged from chaos as the first stable thing in a universe that was still learning what stability meant. And so Gaia settled into herself, and the world began to have a flaw. The surface of the early Earth, if it can be called a surface, if it can be called Earth, was nothing like the world that would eventually be mapped and named and cultivated and mourned. It was raw in a way that the word raw cannot adequately convey. A landscape of cooling stone and rising steam, of volcanic plains stretching to horizons that had no features yet, of shallow seas filling the basins between new-formed ridges with water that was warm and mineral-rich and carried within it the dissolved memory of the chaos from which everything had come. There were no forests yet, no mountains with names, no rivers running to the sea by paths worn smooth by long use. There was only the vast, patient, primordial surface of Gaia, spreading in every direction beneath the sky that Nyx still held in her dark embrace, waiting for the light that was coming, that had always been coming, that the principle of Eros had made inevitable from the first moment of the first stirring in the first void. The sky above this early world was still learning to be blue. It held the darkness of Nyx and the luminous potential of Aether in an uneasy mixture, shifting between states that had no names, cycling through qualities of light and shadow that no human eye would ever see because no human eye yet existed to see them. The mountains that would eventually rise from Gaia's surface were still compressed within her, waiting for the pressures that would push them upward. The seas were still finding their levels. The deep places of the earth, where Tartarus pressed its cold weight against the underside of everything, were still settling into the permanent darkness that would define them for all the ages that followed. This was the world before the world had a name, before Olympus, before the Titans, before the long catastrophes and reconciliations of the divine age, before the first human being looked up at the sky and wondered what it was. There was this, the slow, enormous, patient work of a cosmos coming into being from a void that had held everything within it, compressed beyond comprehension, waiting for the moment when chaos would open and the first conditions of existence would step forward into the vast, dark, beautiful, terrifying space that was learning, slowly, to become the world. The world that Gaia had become was not yet finished, and it knew this about itself. The surface of the early Earth still moved with the restlessness of something in the process of becoming, ridge lines pushing upward through the rest, crust in long, slow convulsions. The first mountain ranges erupting from the ground, not as the gradual accumulations of geological patience, but as sudden, violent assertions of stone against sky, peaks rising in columns of dark rock that caught the earliest light and held it against their faces like a question that had not yet found its answer. Above this surface, Uranus spread himself as the sky, and the relationship between Gaia and Uranus in this earliest age was one of suffocating intimacy. The sky did not rest at a comfortable distance above the earth, as it would in later ages. It pressed down, close and heavy in total, the dome of heaven lying against the surface of the world, with the weight of everything above bearing down upon everything below. The air between them was dense with moisture and volcanic heat, thick with the exhalations of a planet still cooling from its own formation, and the quality of light that filtered through this atmosphere was amber and gold, and the deep orange of fire, seen through smoke, a light that illuminated without clarifying, that revealed the shapes of things while obscuring their details. From the union of Gaia and Uranus, the first great children of the world emerged. The Titans came into being as forces that the landscape itself seemed to require, enormous, idealized, their scale commensurate with the world they inhabited, rather than with anything that would later be called human. Oceanus, eldest of the Titans, was the great river that encircled the world. His presence felt in every coastline, where the known earth dissolved into the unknown sea, his body the boundary between the comprehensible and the time-sea infinite. Hyperion carried in his form the quality of the light above the clouds, that etheric brightness that Nyx had first given way to, now concentrated into a presence that moved through the sky, with the unhurried authority of something that has never needed to justify its existence. Themis was the weight of natural law felt in the regularity of seasons, in the reliable return of warmth after cold, in the way the tides obeyed their own ancient rhythms without instruction. These were not beings in the way that later tradition would render beings, not personalities with preferences and grievances and the small vanities of the humanoid divine. They were the world's first attempt to understand itself through form, the cosmos organizing its own deepest principles into shapes that could be named and therefore, in some sense, known. Their weight was felt in the trembling of the ground when the earth shifted beneath new mountain ranges. Their breath moved in the great storm systems that crossed the young sky from horizon to horizon, carrying rain in curtains of silver and grey that fell on stone that had never known rain before, and received it with the patience of something that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting for exactly this. Among the children of Gaia and Uranus were others whose nature was more difficult to hold in the mind as a single image. The Cyclops, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, whose names carried the sounds of thunder and lightning and brightness, inhabited environments of impossible depth and heat, the volcanic chambers beneath the earth's surface where stone ran liquid and the air was thick with sulfur, and the pressure of deep places. Their single eyes, set in faces of superhuman scale and idealized power, were described by ancient tradition as reflecting the fire of the forge, not metaphorically, but literally, as though the light of the deep earth had found its way into their gaze and could not be extinguished. The caverns they inhabited were not merely large, they were architecturally impossible. chambers of natural stone that descended through layer after layer of the Earth's interior, their walls glittering with mineral deposits that caught the light of volcanic fire and scattered it in amber and gold and the deep red of heated iron. The Hecatoncheires, Cottus, Briareus, and Gages, the 100-handed ones, were presences that the shoreline knew before any other environment. The coastlines they inhabited were not the gentle, sun-warmed shores of later Mediterranean imagination. They were the raw edges of a young world, where the sea had not yet worn the stone smooth, where waves of inhuman scale broke against cliffs that had only recently risen from the Earth's interior, where the spray carried the cold of deep water and the smell of the open ocean beyond the horizon. The scale of these beings was registered in the environment rather than described directly. The waves that broke around them were larger than ordinary waves. The stones they moved left impressions in the earth that would eventually become valleys. The sound of their movement was indistinguishable from the sound of the sea itself in its most violent moods. But Uranus looked upon these children, the Cyclops and the Hecatoncheires, and something in the sky recoiled. Ancient tradition, preserved most completely in Hesiod's Theogony, records that Uranus hated these offspring from the moment of their birth, hiding them away within the body of Gaia rather than allowing them to emerge into the light. The landscape registered this act as a kind of geological catastrophe, the earth pressing inward upon itself, the deep places becoming deeper and darker, the weight of the sky bearing down with renewed intensity, as though the act of suppression required the active participation of the heavens. Gaia groaned under this weight in a way that the ancient sources describe as both physical and moral, the earth suffering under the injustice of what was being done within her, the pain of it felt in the trembling of the ground and the heat rising from volcanic vents, and the restless movement of the seas against their newly formed shores. The darkness of those imprisoned places was a specific and terrible darkness. It was not the darkness of Erebus, which was primordial and impersonal, and carried no judgment within it. It was the darkness of enclosure, of stone pressed over living things, of depth weaponized as punishment, of the earth's interior turned from a place of formation into a place of confinement. The Cyclops and Hecatoncheires existed within this darkness for ages whose length defies ordinary reckoning. Their presence felt in the occasional deep tremor that moved through the earth's crust, in the sudden eruption of volcanic fire through the surface, in the way the ground sometimes shifted without warning, as though something enormous were turning in its sleep far below. Gaia's response to this injustice was patient and deliberate, and terrible in the way that geological processes are terrible, slow, inevitable, operating on a timescale that makes the urgency of individual moments seem irrelevant. From her own body she drew forth the grey flint of the earth's deep stone, and from this she fashioned the great sickle, an instrument whose description in ancient sources carries the weight of something that was made not merely to cut, but to sever, to end, to transform the relationship between sky and earth permanently and without the possibility of reversal. She brought this instrument to her Titan children and asked which among them would take it and use it. The silence that followed was the silence of the world holding its breath, the stillness before a geological event, the quality of air before a storm of unprecedented scale. Kronos, youngest of the great Titans, took the sickle. His willingness was not described by ancient tradition as courage, exactly, or as righteousness, or as love for his imprisoned siblings. It was something colder and more absolute, an ambition that was itself a force of nature, as impersonal as the volcanic fire, and as patient as the stone. He waited in the amber darkness of the Earth's interior, while Uranus descended to lie against Gaia, as he always had, the sky pressing down upon the Earth in that ancient, suffocating intimacy. And then the act was done, and the sky and the Earth were separated, and the world changed in a single moment that no landscape could absorb without transformation. The separation of Uranus from Gaia was not merely a mythological event. It was the creation of distance, the through establishment of the gap between heaven and earth that would define the structure of the cosmos for all the ages that followed. The sky rose away from the Earth's surface and took its place at the height it has occupied ever since, and the air between them, that amber, volcanic, moisture-heavy atmosphere of the earliest age, began slowly to clarify, to thin, to become the blue transparency that the sky would eventually be known by. The light changed. The world breathed differently. The mountains that had been pressing upward against the weight of a sky that lay directly upon them suddenly found themselves rising into open air, their peaks catching a light that was cleaner and colder and more honest than anything that had illuminated the world before. What followed was the age of the Titans in their fullness, the long golden reign that ancient tradition remembers as a time of extraordinary abundance. The earth produced without labor, the ancient sources record, and the landscape of this age reflected that generosity in every detail. The plains were covered in grasses of extraordinary richness, the forests dense and unhurried, the rivers running clear and cold from mountains that had found their final heights and were no longer growing. The air was warm with a warmth that had no edge of threat in it, not the heat of volcanic fire or the oppressive closeness of the sky against the earth, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from the world itself, rather than from any external source. The seas in this age had found their basins and filled them with cold, dark water that carried the mineral memory of the Earth's formation in its depths, time at course 900 milliquarters. The surface of the sea caught the light of a sky that was still learning its final color, shifting between the deep blue of clear air and the wine dark of late afternoon and the silver grey of overcast morning, each quality of light revealing a different aspect of the water's nature. Oceanus moved through these waters as both presence and environment, his body the boundary of the known world, his current the great river that encircled everything, carrying the warmth of the equatorial regions toward the cold of the north and the cold of the deep toward the warmth of the surface, in a circulation that would persist for all the ages of the world. This was the world at a kind of terrible perfect rest. The Titans moved through it as environmental forces, their footsteps felt in the trembling of distant ground, their breathing in the movement of weather systems across the sky, their presence in the quality of the light at different hours of the day. The Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires remained imprisoned in the deep earth, their confinement a wound in the world's justice that had not yet been addressed, their presence felt only in the occasional tremor and the heat of volcanic vents. Above it all, the separated sky of Uranus spread its dome over a world that was abundant and ordered and beautiful, and beneath the surface of all that beauty, already carrying within it the seeds of the catastrophe that was coming. The long, patient, inevitable catastrophe that would end this age and begin the next. The world rested in its golden stillness and did not yet know what was gathering in the silence beneath it. The kingdom of Kronos was a kingdom of Kronos surfaces. Everything that the eye could find in that age was ordered, productive and correct. The fields yielding their abundance in proper season, the rivers running within their appointed channels, the sky maintaining its careful distance above the earth with the regularity of something that has been commanded to behave and has not yet found reason to disobey. But beneath every surface, in the quality of the air itself, in the way the light fell across the plains without quite warming them, there was something that the ancient sources understood as suppression, a world held in place not by natural equilibrium, but by the continuous, exhausting application of fear. Kronos had taken the throne of the cosmos with the cold ambition that had always defined him, and he ruled it with the same quality of attention that a stone gives to the thing it holds beneath it. The Cyclops and Hecatoncheires, whose liberation Gaia had sought when she armed her youngest son with the grey flint sickle, remained in their deep imprisonment. Kronos had looked upon them as Uranus had looked upon them, with the same recoil, the same refusal, the same instinct to bury what could not be controlled. The wound in the world's justice that their confinement represented had not been healed, it had merely changed its warden. The prophecy came to Kronos as prophecies always come in the ancient tradition, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something already suspected, a fear given the terrible dignity of divine utterance. Gaia and Uranus, according to the sources, told him what was coming, that one of his own children would do to him what he had done to his father, that the pattern of overthrow was not a singular event, but a structure built into the nature of divine succession itself. Kronos received this knowledge and responded to it in the only way that his nature permitted, not with acceptance, not with the wisdom that might have transformed the prophecy into something other than destiny, but with the same cold, absolute geological force that had always been his defining quality. He would consume what threatened him. He would hold within himself the very thing that the world was trying to bring forth. Each child born to Kronos and Rhea was swallowed at the moment of birth, drawn back into the body of their father before they could draw the first breath of the world's air. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each in turn, disappearance into the darkness of Kronos. And the world registered each disappearance as a subtle diminishment, a quality of light becoming slightly less rich, a warmth becoming slightly less genuine, the abundance of the golden age continuing in form while losing something essential from its substance. The landscape of this age was a landscape of potential that could not actualize itself, of divine forces compressed into a darkness that was not the primordial darkness of chaos, or the deep darkness of Tartarus, but something more specific and more terrible, the darkness of a thing that exists but cannot become what it is. On the island of Crete, in a cave set deep within the body of Mount Ida, something different was being prepared. The cave itself was an environment unlike any other place in the world of that age, close and warm and smelling of rock and milk and the smoke of small fires, its walls of natural limestone pressing in, with the intimacy of a place that has been chosen for its hiddenness rather than its grandeur. The air inside moved with the slow circulation of deep enclosed spaces, carrying the warmth of the earth's interior upward through the stone floor. Through the stone floor, mixing it with the cooler air that filtered in from the mountain above. The light was amber and uncertain, the light of small flames in a large darkness, catching the mineral surfaces of the cave walls and returning them as a soft, scattered glow that illuminated without exposing. Rhea had come here with the knowledge that Gaia had given her, the same knowledge that Gaia had always given to those who were willing to receive it, the patient, geological wisdom of the earth that understands how things grow in hidden places before they are ready to emerge into the light. The child born in that cave on Crete was wrapped and hidden and protected by the deep earth itself, and in his place Rhea gave Kronos a stone, wrapped in swaddling cloth, the omphalos stone, which ancient tradition preserves as the object that deceived the devouring king, the stone that was swallowed in place of the god who would end his reign. Kronos took the stone and swallowed it without examination, and the cave on Mount Ida held its secret in the closed, warm, milk-scented darkness, and the world continued its ordered, joyless, suppressed abundance, and did not yet know what was growing within the mountain. The child grew in that hidden environment, as things grow in hidden environments, without the knowledge of those who would prevent the growing, nourished by the earth itself, shaped by the particular quality of a place that has been chosen by necessity and consecrated by the act of protection. Ancient tradition records the curates, divine attendants who clashed their weapons together around the cave to cover the sounds of the child within, and their presence transformed the environment of Mount Ida into something charged and deliberate, the mountain itself becoming a kind of architecture of concealment, its stone walls and deep passages and close air all participating in the act of preservation. The world outside continued under the reign of Kronos, ordered and fearful and productive and hollow, while inside the mountain something was becoming that would unmake the order entirely. When the time came, the confrontation between Zeus and Kronos began not as a single dramatic moment, but as a process, the forced disgorging of the swallowed gods, the liberation of the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires from their deep imprisonment, the slow assembly of forces that would eventually become the Olympian order. The Cyclopes, freed at last from the darkness that had held them since before the age of the Titans, brought with them the gifts that ancient tradition assigns to them, the thunderbolt for Zeus, the helmet of invisibility for Hades, the trident for Poseidon. These were not merely weapons, they were the concentrated power of the deep earth. They were the concentrated power of the deep earth, the volcanic fire and the crushing pressure of fathoms of stone, given form and purpose and placed in the hands of a new generation of divine beings. The Titanomachy, the 10-year war between the Olympians and the Titans, was not a war in any sense that human experience of war can adequately illuminate. It was an environmental catastrophe of cosmic scale. It was an environmental catastrophe of cosmic scale, a transformation of the world's landscape so total and so violent that the terrain it left behind was fundamentally different from the terrain that had existed before it. The ancient sources, including Hesiod's account in the Theogony, describe it in terms that are always environmental rather than tactical. Mountains used as weapons, the sky cracking under the force of divine collision, the sea churned to a white chaos that bore no resemblance to the contained, ordered waters of Kronos' reign. The mountains of the world became projectiles in this conflict, lifted and hurled by beings of superhuman scale across distances that no ordinary force could bridge. Where they landed, new ridgelines were created, shattered, irregular, bearing in their broken geometry the evidence of the violence that had formed them. The productive plains of the Golden Age were torn open, their surfaces disrupted by the impacts of divine warfare, the careful order of Kronos' kingdom dismantled, not by intention, but as a consequence of forces that had no regard for the landscape they were destroying. The sky itself cracked under the force of the thunderbolts that Zeus wielded, great fissures of light opening across the dome of heaven, fire falling through them in rivers of gold and white that struck the earth and left it scorched and transformed. For 10 years the world endured this. The earth trembled continuously, not with the slow deep trembling of geological process, but with the sharp, percussive trembling of repeated catastrophic impact, the star ground shaking with a frequency that left nothing stable, that turned the careful geography of the Titan Age into a landscape of constant, violent revision. The sea was churned from its basins, great walls of water rising and falling across coastlines that had been stable for ages, the cold, dark depths brought to the surface and the warm surface waters driven down into the cold. The entire ocean in a state of white, roaring chaos that bore the memory of Oceanus's ordered circulation only as an absence, a negative space where regularity had been. The Hecatoncheires fought on the side of the Olympians, and their contribution to the war was registered in the landscape as a specific kind of devastation, the devastation of overwhelming force applied without restraint, of 100 hands hurling stone simultaneously, of impacts so numerous and so powerful that the terrain beneath them was not merely damaged, but fundamentally reconstituted. The Titans fell back before this assault, and their retreat was itself an environmental event, the withdrawal of enormous divine presences from regions they had occupied for ages, leaving behind them a landscape that was quieter and emptier and somehow diminished, the way a forest is diminished after the great trees have been removed, even if what replaces them is more ordered and more manageable. The defeat of the Titans was total, and the landscape registered it as a ceiling. Tartarus opened beneath the world to receive them, that deepest of all deep places, the abyss beneath the abyss, the darkness that had been present since the first moments of creation and had been waiting, with the patience of something that has no concept of time for this particular use. The Titans were driven down through layer after layer of the Earth's interior, through the stone and the volcanic chambers, and the deep cold places where no light had ever penetrated, into the absolute darkness of Tartarus itself. Bronze walls were built around them, according to ancient tradition, walls that were not merely architectural, but cosmological, a boundary between the world of the living and the place of ultimate confinement, sealed with the weight of everything above and surrounded by the triple darkness of the deepest earth. Kronos himself descended into this confinement, and the world above registered his departure as a shift in the quality of the air, the suppression lifting, the sealed and controlled atmosphere of his reign dissolving, the sky opening to a quality of light that had not been present since before his ascension. Some ancient traditions record a different fate for Kronos, a reconciliation, an eventual reign over the blessed dead in the islands of the west. But the primary tradition of Hesiod places him in Tartarus with his fellow Titans, and it is this version that the landscape of the world seems to confirm. In the deep tremors that still move through the earth occasionally, in the volcanic fire that still breaks through the surface, in the sense that something enormous is still contained beneath everything, pressing upward against the weight of the world above it. The scarred terrain that the Titanomachy left behind was the new geography of the world. The shattered ridgelines, the disrupted plains, the coastlines redrawn by the violence of the churned sea. These were not wounds waiting to heal, but the permanent features of a world that had been remade by divine conflict. The mountains bore in their broken profiles the evidence of having been used as weapons. The deep trenches of the seafloor carried the memory of impacts that had driven the Earth's crust downward. The volcanic vents that opened across the landscape were the exhalations of a deep Earth, still settling after the catastrophic disturbance of the war. And then, above all of this, Olympus. The summit of the great mountain had always been there, rising above the cloud cover into a quality of air that was different from the air of the lower slopes, thinner, colder, carrying a light that was cleaner and more direct than the amber filtered light of the world below. But after the Titanomachy, something changed about that summit. The light that fell upon it was no longer merely the light of the sky at altitude. It was something else, a luminosity that seemed to come from the mountain itself, as much as from above it, a golden saturation of the air that had no meteorological explanation, that registered in the quality of the stone, and the quality of the silence, and the quality of the view from the summit, as the presence of something that had always been latent in that place, and had now, finally, been permitted to become actual. The architecture of the divine realm appeared on that summit as though it had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of the mountain for the moment when the world was ready to receive it. Colonnades of white marble caught the extraordinary light and returned it multiplied, the stone veined with gold that seemed to carry its own illumination. The proportions of the structures neither human-scaled nor incomprehensibly vast, but something precisely between, large enough to contain divine presences, ordered enough to suggest the governance that those presences would now exercise over the world below. The air on the summit was the air of aether, that luminous upper atmosphere that Nyx had first given way to in the earliest moments of creation, now concentrated and permanent, a medium in which the gods moved with the ease of beings who had finally arrived at the place that had been prepared for them since before the world had a name. Below the summit, the mortal world spread in every direction, scarred and remade and still settling into its new geography, the plains and mountains and seas of a world that had survived its first great catastrophe and was learning, slowly, what it meant to be governed by Olympus rather than by the cold, fearful order of Kronos. The division of realms had not yet been formalized. The sea and the underworld and the sky above the earth had not yet been assigned to their divine custodians by the drawing of lots that ancient tradition records, but the structure of the new order was already present in the quality of the light on Olympus, in the depth of the sealed Tartarus below, in the vast, patient, wine-dark expanse of the sea, waiting for the god who would claim it. The world had been divided by a catastrophe, and now it waited to be divided by intention. The approach to Olympus begins long before the mountain becomes visible. It begins in the quality of the air at the base of the northern Greek plain, where something shifts almost imperceptibly in the atmosphere. A paean, a pla, slight increase in clarity, a marginally greater depth to the blue of the sky, a quality of light that seems to arrive from a direction slightly different from where the sun actually stands. Travelers moving northward through the ancient world would have felt this change before they understood its source, the way one feels the proximity of the sea before the sea comes into view, not as a sensation exactly, but as a change in the character of sensation itself, a heightening of the world's ordinary qualities towards something that ordinary language struggles to name. The mountain rises from the coastal plain with an abruptness that the surrounding terrain does nothing to prepare the eye for. Its lower slopes are forested in the manner of all great mountains. Dense stands of oak and pine climbing through the foothills. The undergrowth, rich and dark, the light filtering through the canopy in the amber and gold of a world still operating within ordinary atmospheric conditions. Rivers descend through these lower slopes with the urgency of water that has come from altitude and remembers it, cold and clear, and carrying the mineral taste of the deep stone through which they have passed. The paths that wind upward through this forest are paths that the world knows, paths worn by the passage of things that belong to the mortal order. Their surfaces the familiar terracotta of Greek mountain soil, their edges marked by the ordinary wildflowers of the Mediterranean spring. But the cloud cover changes everything. At a certain elevation, the mountain enters the clouds that gather permanently around its middle slopes, and this transition is not gradual but decisive, a crossing of a threshold that the atmosphere marks with the same clarity that a shoreline marks the boundary between land and sea. Below the clouds, the world is the world, visible, comprehensible, operating according to the principles that govern mortal experience. Within the clouds, there is only the grey, close, moisture-heavy atmosphere of the cloud interior, the visibility reduced to the immediate, the sense of direction dissolving, the sounds of the lower world muffled and then silenced entirely, This is the boundary that the ancient tradition understood as the threshold between the mortal and divine realms. Not a wall, not a gate, but a change in the quality of the medium through which one moves, a dissolution of the ordinary that precedes the revelation of the extraordinary. Above the clouds, the world transforms. The summit of Olympus, with its highest peak, Mythicus, reaching upward to 2,917 meters above the sea, emerges from the cloud cover into a quality of light that has no equivalent in the lower world. The air here is the etheric air of the ancient cosmology, that luminous upper atmosphere that was among the first things to emerge from the primordial void, the medium in which the gods move as naturally as mortal beings move through the warm, dense air of the plains below. It is thinner than the air of the lower slopes, and yet it does not feel thin in the way that altitude ordinarily makes air feel thin, depleted, insufficient, a diminishment of what the lungs require. It feels instead richer, more saturated with something that is not quite warmth and not quite light, but partakes of both, a quality that the ancient sources describe as the very substance of divine existence, the medium in which immortality is not a condition imposed upon beings, but the natural consequence of breathing an air that carries no decay within it. The golden gates of the heavenly fortress were guarded, according to ancient tradition, by the three Horai, the goddesses of the seasons, 100 and past, whose role as gatekeepers was not merely ceremonial, but cosmological. They stood at the threshold between the etheric realm of the summit and the cloud cover below, and their presence was felt in the way that seasonal transitions are felt, not as a single moment, but as a gradual change in the quality of everything, a shift in the light and the temperature and the smell of the air that announces the passage from one condition to another. The gates themselves, as ancient sources describe them, were not gates in the architectural sense of barriers designed to exclude. They were gates in the sense of a concentrated threshold, a place where the transition between mortal and divine atmosphere was made visible and deliberate, where the change that had been occurring gradually through the cloud cover was given a specific located moment of completion. The summit architecture of Olympus, as the ancient tradition imagined it and as the sources preserve it, was an architecture of white marble veined with gold. The colonnades that defined the great halls of the divine court were built to a scale that was neither human nor incomprehensibly vast, a scale calibrated to the beings who inhabited them, whose forms the ancient sculptural tradition rendered as idealized human shapes magnified to superhuman dimensions, every proportion perfect, every surface smooth as the finest pentelic marble, every gesture carrying the authority of beings who have never been uncertain about anything. The columns of these halls were of the Doric order in their fundamental gravity, unfluted shafts of extraordinary diameter, their capitals simple and massive, their entablatures carrying the weight of heaven with the same quiet confidence that the mountain itself carried the weight of the structures built upon it. The great banquet table of the gods was set at the center of the primary hall, and its description in ancient sources carries the weight of something that is simultaneously a piece of furniture and a cosmological statement. The vessels upon it were of hammered gold, not the thin, decorative gold of mortal craftsmanship, but gold worked to a thickness and a density that suggested the material itself had been transformed by divine handling, that the gold of Olympus was to the gold of the mortal world what the etheric air of the summit was to the air of the plains below, the same substance, but more fully itself. And nectar, the food and drink of immortality, rested in these vessels with the stillness of things that have no urgency about them. That will remain what they are, regardless of how much time passes, because time on Olympus does not operate as it does in the mortal world below. The individual domains of the divine court were distributed across the summit with a spatial logic that reflected the nature of each deity they housed. At the heart of the summit complex, the palace of Zeus occupied the position of greatest elevation and greatest exposure to the etheric light, a structure whose proportions suggested absolute authority without the need for ostentation, its columns massive, and its interior vast, the quality of light within it, the concentrated gold of the summit atmosphere, gathered and multiplied by the reflective surfaces of marble and metal. The throne of Zeus, as ancient tradition describes it, was not merely a seat, but an environment in itself. The air around it carrying a charge that was felt before the throne came into view, a pressure in the atmosphere that was not oppressive but was unmistakably the pressure of the greatest concentration of divine power in the cosmos. Moving through the summit complex, the atmosphere changed with each precinct entered. The workshop of Hephaestus occupied a region of the summit where the etheric air was warmed by the heat of the divine forge, not the volcanic heat of the deep earth, where the Cyclops had labored in their imprisonment, but a refined, controlled heat that smelled of heated metal, and the particular mineral sharpness of stone worked at high temperature. The light in Hephaestus's domain was the amber and orange of forge fire, shifting and alive in a way that the steady golden light of the rest of the summit was not, and the surfaces of the objects being worked there caught this light and returned it in fragments. The hammered faces of divine armor, the curved surfaces of vessels being shaped, the tools of the greatest craftsman in the cosmos, arranged with the order of a mind that thinks in 3 dimensions and in metal. The precinct of Artemis at the edge of the summit was the coolest and most silver of the divine domains. The light there had a quality of moonlight even in full day, not the warm gold of the central summit, but a clear, cool luminosity that seemed to come from the stone itself rather than from above, that illuminated without warming, that revealed the shapes of things with perfect clarity, while maintaining a quality of reserve, of distance, of the wild places that Artemis claimed as her own. In the mortal world below, translated into the architectural language of the divine summit, the air in her precinct carried a smell of pine and cold stone, and the particular freshness of high altitude, and the silence there was the silence of forests rather than the silence of halls, alive with the potential of things that move without being seen. Apollo's precinct was wine dark and laurel scented, the air heavy with the smell of the sacred plant, and with something else, a quality of resonance, as though the atmosphere itself were vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, the way a plucked string continues to vibrate after the sound has faded. The light in Apollo's domain was the light of the sun at its most direct and most clarifying. Not the golden warmth of the central summit, but a white, precise illumination that left no shadow and no ambiguity. That revealed everything it touched with the same impartial completeness that the Delphic oracle would eventually bring to the questions of mortals. The surfaces of Apollo's precinct were the smoothest on the summit. The marble worked to a finish that reflected the surrounding light with mirror-like precision. The proportions of every structure expressing the mathematical relationships that ancient tradition associated with divine harmony. The quarter of Ares was defined by a martial geometry that stood in deliberate contrast to the organic richness of the other precincts. The air there carried the smell of iron, cold and sharp, and carrying within it the memory of blood, though no blood had ever been shed on Olympus, and the light was the particular hard light of overcast sky. A flat, directionless illumination that revealed surfaces without beautifying them, that showed the edges of things with the clarity of a blade. The architecture of Ares' domain was the most severe on the summit. Columns without ornament, surfaces without decoration, the proportions expressing function rather than beauty, the whole space organized around the principle that power requires no adornment, and that the most honest expression of force is force itself, unmediated and undisguised. When Poseidon visited the summit from his deep-sea palace, his presence transformed the atmosphere of whatever space he occupied. The light around him took on the deep blue-green of ocean water at depth, not the surface blue of the Aegean on a clear day, but the color of water seen from below, looking upward toward a surface that is far away and growing farther, a color that carries within it the cold and the pressure and the absolute otherness of the deep sea. The air in his vicinity moved with the slow, powerful rhythm of deep water currents, and the sound of the sea was present in it. Not the crashing of waves against shore, but the deep, continuous, omnidirectional sound of open ocean, the sound of water moving in 3 dimensions simultaneously, the sound of the largest environment on Earth making itself known. From the summit of Olympus, the mortal world spread below like a painted map on the finest ivory. The curve of the sea was visible at the horizon, the Aegean and beyond it, the wider Mediterranean, its surface catching the light in the particular way that large bodies of water catch light from altitude, not as a uniform color, but as a shifting, complex surface of silver and blue, and the wine dark of deep water, the whole expanse moving with a slowness that was only apparent from this height. The thread-thin paths of rivers were visible as lines of silver light cutting through the darker tones of the landscape, finding their way from the mountains to the sea by the paths of least resistance that they had been carving since the world was new. The tiny geometric patterns of the earliest city-states were visible as interruptions in the organic texture of the landscape. The straight lines of walls, the regular spacing of cultivated fields, the small bright points of temple rooftops catching the sun. The silence before the gods gathered for divine assembly was a specific and extraordinary silence. It was not the silence of emptiness. The summit was never empty of the etheric presence that saturated its atmosphere, but the silence of anticipation, the quality of stillness that precedes an event of enormous consequence. The light intensified in the moments before assembly, the golden saturation of the summit air deepening towards something that was almost visible as a substance. The marble of the colonnades seeming to glow, the marble of the colonnades seeming to glow from within rather than merely to reflect the light from above. The air moved with a slow, deliberate circulation that had no meteorological explanation, a movement that seemed to be the summit itself breathing in preparation for what was coming. And then the presences arrived, enormous, idealized, moving through the etheric air of the summit with the ease of beings for whom this environment was not a place visited but a nature expressed. Their scale filled the colonnaded halls without overwhelming them, the architecture having been built to exactly this purpose, to contain divine presences without diminishing them, to give the inhuman a human-scaled context without pretending that the human and the divine were equivalent. The sound of divine assembly was not the sound of voices, because this narration carries no voices within it. It was the sound of the summit itself responding to the concentration of divine presence, the marble resonating at frequencies below hearing, the etheric air thickening and brightening, the view from the summit sharpening as though the world below were being brought into focus by the attention of the gods now gathered above it. Olympus was not merely the home of the gods. It was the place where the cosmos understood itself, where the forces that had emerged from chaos and differentiated through the long ages of Titans and Olympians found their final, ordered expression in an architecture of white marble and gold light, set above the cloud cover of the mortal world, breathing the etheric air of the upper cosmos, looking down upon the painted map of human existence with the calm, enormous, inhuman attention of beings who had been present since before the world had a name and would remain present long after the last mortal city had returned to the earth from which it came. There is a moment at sea, far from any shore, when the water beneath a vessel becomes something other than water. The surface still moves with the familiar rhythms of wind and current, still catches the light in the shifting silver and wine-dark patterns that the Aegean has always worn, still carries the smell of salt and the cold exhalation of depth. But the mind, confronting the fact of what lies beneath, the fathoms of absolute cold, the lightless plains, the trenches of incomprehensible depth pressing downward through the earth's crust toward the darkness that has no bottom, undergoes a change that is not fear exactly, but something older than fear, something that the ancient Greeks understood when they named the sea's ruler and gave him a trident and a palace of coral and deep stone and the permanent, restless authority of the largest realm in the known world. The division of the cosmos among the three sons of Kronos was accomplished, according to ancient tradition, by the drawing of lots. Zeus received the sky and the sovereignty of the divine order. Hades received the realm beneath the earth. Poseidon received the sea. And of the three realms, the sea was in certain respects the most immediate, the most present, the most continuously felt by the mortal world that lay between all three. The earth was solid and could be walked upon. The sky was visible and could be read for signs. But the sea surrounded the known world on every side, penetrated its coastlines, with the sea surrounded the known world on every side, penetrated its coastlines. Hitherto, 1,000 inlets and harbours provided the paths along which trade and war and exploration moved, and concealed beneath its surface an environment so alien to mortal experience that it might as well have been another cosmos entirely. The surface of the Aegean in the ancient imagination was a living thing, not metaphorically, but in the most literal sense that the Greek mythological tradition permitted. Its colour changed with the light and the season and the depth of water beneath it. The pale turquoise of shallow coastal waters over pale sand, the deep blue of open water under clear sky. The wine dark of late afternoon when the sun moved toward the western horizon and the sea absorbed its light rather than reflecting it. The silver grey of overcast morning when the sky and the sea exchanged their qualities and the boundary between them dissolved into a single undifferentiated luminosity. At sunset, the surface became firelit, the western horizon burning in amber and gold. The sea beneath it, carrying those colours in a broken, moving mosaic that shifted with every wave, the whole expanse between the shore and the horizon, transformed into something that was neither water nor fire, but partook of both. Below the surface, the world changed immediately and completely. Even at shallow depths, the quality of light underwent a transformation that the ancient mind understood as a crossing of a threshold. The warm, one-pound, direct light of the Mediterranean sun becoming something filtered and diffuse and blue-green, the shapes of things losing their hard edges, the sounds of the surface world muffled and then silenced by the weight of water above. At greater depths, the light failed entirely, and the world became what the deep sea has always been, cold and dark, and pressured and ancient beyond any reckoning that the surface world provides tools to perform. The cold of the deep Mediterranean was not the cold of winter air or mountain stone. It was the cold of a place that has never been warm, that carries within it the temperature of the original ocean, the water that filled the first sea basins, when the world was new and the sun's warmth had not yet penetrated to the floor. The palace of Poseidon, as ancient tradition imagined it, was built in the deep places where the pressure of fathoms of water creates a silence unlike any other silence on earth. It was a palace of coral and deep stone, not the bright coral of shallow tropical waters, but the slow, dark coral of the Mediterranean deep, built over centuries into structures of extraordinary complexity, its surfaces encrusted with the accumulated life of the seafloor, its colours the deep reds and purples and blacks of organisms that have never known sunlight. The stone of its foundations was the stone of the seafloor itself, basalt and limestone worn smooth by the movement of deep currents, its surfaces carrying the marks of geological time in their layering, each stratum a record of an age of the world's history compressed into a few centimeters of rock. The silence of the deep sea palace was the silence of absolute pressure, the weight of the ocean above pressing down on everything below with a force that the surface world has no equivalent for, a force that does not merely prevent sound from traveling, but seems to absorb it, to take the energy of vibration and convert it into the stillness of the deep. In this silence, the presence of Poseidon was felt not as sound or movement, but as a change in the quality of the pressure itself, a directional quality of the pressure itself, a directional quality entering what had been omnidirectional, a sense of enormous controlled force gathering itself in a specific location rather than being distributed evenly through the water column. When he moved to his realm, the deep currents shifted in response, the cold water of the abyssal plains stirring with the slow, powerful circulation of something that moves not because it is pushed, but because it chooses to move. And the choice of something that size is indistinguishable from a geological event. The sea floor as a landscape was understood by the ancient imagination through the evidence of what the sea returned to the surface, the creatures that fishermen brought up from depth, the cold water that upwelled along certain coastlines, the occasional eruption of volcanic fire through the sea floor that sent columns of heated water and sulfurous gas rising through the water column to break the surface in a disturbance that had no apparent cause. From these fragments, the ancient mind constructed a landscape of trenches of absolute darkness, plains of pale sand where nothing moved, the ruins of things older than the Olympians, resting in the cold. The trenches were understood as the deepest wounds in the earth's surface, places where the seafloor dropped away into darkness so complete that even the deep sea cold seemed warm by comparison, where the pressure was so total that the concept of a solid object became uncertain, where the ancient darkness of Tartarus pressed upward against the underside of the sea floor from below. The transition from the sea to the underworld was, in the ancient geographical imagination, a matter of direction rather than distance. Both realms shared the quality of depth, of darkness, of removal from the warm, light-filled surface of the mortal world. The underworld, Hades, named for its ruler, as the sources consistently record, was understood to be located at the periphery of the earth, associated either with the outer limits of the great river Oceanus or with the regions beneath the earth's surface, reached through cave mouths and volcanic vents and the dark passages that opened in certain places where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead was thin. The descent to the underworld, as the ancient tradition describes it across multiple sources, was a journey through changing environments, each one marking a further remove from the world of the living. The cave mouth that served as the entrance was always cold, not with the cold of winter or altitude, but with a specific, sourceless cold that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, as though the rock were exhaling the temperature of the deep earth, the chill of places that have never known warmth rising through the passage and meeting the warm air of the surface world in a boundary that the body registered before the mind understood what this meant. The darkness inside was immediate and total, the light of the surface world cut off within a few steps of the entrance, the eyes finding nothing to adjust to because there was nothing. Not the relative darkness of a room with shuttered windows, but the absolute darkness of a place that has never contained light and does not know what light is. The river Styx was the first great environmental threshold of the underworld. Ancient sources, including the detailed geography preserved in later classical tradition, describe it as black and still, not the black of deep water seen from above, which carries within it the reflected colors of the sky, but a black that was the color of the water itself as though the river carried darkness as its substance rather than water. The Styx moved with a slowness that was almost indistinguishable from stillness, its current perceptible only in the gradual movement of objects on its surface, and the weight of every oath ever sworn upon it by the gods was present in the quality of the water, a heaviness, a gravity, a sense that this river carried something more than water in its current, that the accumulated moral weight of divine promises had become a physical property of the stream itself. Beyond the Styx, the geography of the underworld differentiated itself into distinct regions, each with its own atmospheric character. The Asphodel Meadows, where the majority of the dead were understood to dwell, were described in ancient tradition as a landscape of grey uniformity, grey light, grey air, gay air, grey grass, moving in a wind that had no temperature and no smell. The whole environment a kind of perfect neutrality that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply absent of the qualities that made the living world worth inhabiting. The light in the Asphodel Meadows was the light of a sky that had forgotten how to be blue, a flat, directionless illumination that cast no shadows and revealed no depth, that made every surface look the same distance away, that removed from the landscape the visual cues by which the living world is understood as a three-dimensional space with near and far and above and below. The fields of mourning, reserved for those whose lives had been defined by the grief of love, carried within their atmosphere a quality of the emotion they housed, a heaviness in the air that was not the heaviness of pressure or humidity, but the heaviness of feeling that has nowhere to go, that circles endlessly without resolution. The landscape there was not entirely grey. There were flowers, ancient tradition records, of the kind that grow in places where grief has been present long enough to become part of the soil, but the colours of those flowers were muted, as though the pigment had been diluted by the tears of the beings who moved among them. The Elysian fields stood in devastating contrast to everything that surrounded them. Ancient sources describe this region of the underworld, reserved for the most excellent of mortals, for heroes and the righteous dead, as a landscape of impossible, heartbreaking beauty, green and golden and warm, with a warmth that had no source in any visible sun, a perfection of light and air and the smell of flowering things that was more complete than anything the living world had ever managed to produce. The grass of the Elysian fields was the green of the living world distilled to its essence, the gold of the light, the gold of the finest afternoon, of the finest afternoon, of the finest season, the air carrying the smell of every good thing that the earth produces, grain and olive blossom, and a particular freshness of moving water over clean stone, all present simultaneously, all perfectly balanced, none overwhelming the others. And yet this perfection was the most melancholy environment in the underworld, more melancholy even than the grey uniformity of the Asphodel Meadows, because the beauty of the Elysian fields was a beauty that could be experienced but not returned from, a reward for a life that was over, a perfection that existed on the other side of the boundary that no living thing could cross and recross. The warmth and the green and the golden light were the warmth and the green and the golden light of the living world, perfected and made permanent, and their permanence was the measure of what had been lost. The distance between this unchanging beauty and the changing, imperfect, mortal beauty of the world above, made visible in every detail of the landscape. Tartarus, at the deepest point of the underworld's geography, was an environment of absolute sensory deprivation. The darkness there was not the darkness of the cave entrance or the darkness of the asphodel meadows. It was a darkness so complete it had texture, a substance that pressed against the body the way water presses against a diver, that filled every space, including the spaces within the lungs and behind the eyes. That was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of its opposite, an anti-light, that consumed illumination rather than simply failing to produce it. The cold of Tartarus was the cold of the deepest place in the cosmos, the cold that had been present since before Gaia formed, the cold of the primordial abyss, a total cold that felt not like a temperature, but like a presence, like something that had weight and intention, and had been waiting in this particular darkness since the beginning of everything. The sounds of punishment in Tartarus, the consequences visited upon those whose crimes against the divine order had been most absolute, did not travel upward through the layers of stone as recognizable sounds. They traveled as vibration, a low and continuous trembling in the rock that those in the upper regions of the underworld felt in their feet, and in the surfaces they touched, a reminder that the deepest place was not empty, that the bronze walls and the triple darkness concealed within them the consequences of the world's most ancient transgressions. The Titans in their confinement, the great offenders against divine law in their eternal punishments, their presence was felt not as sound or sight, but as that continuous, sourceless vibration in the stone, the deep earth registering what it contained. The geography of the mortal world, as the ancient Greeks understood it, was bounded on every side by the great river Oceanus, that eldest of the Titans, whose body was the encircling stream at the edge of the known world. The Oikoumene, the inhabited world, lay within this boundary like an island in an infinite sea, its coasts and mountains and river valleys mapped with increasing confidence toward the center and increasing uncertainty toward the edges, where the known dissolved into the rumored and the rumored dissolved into the mythological. Beyond Oceanus, the world became something other than world, the realm of the Hesperides in the far west, the world, land of the Hyperboreans in the far north, the sources of the great rivers in the unmapped interior, all of them existing in that liminal space between geography and myth, where the ancient imagination was most fully itself, most willing to populate the unknown with the extraordinary, most honest about the fact that the world did not end where knowledge ended, but continued into regions that knowledge had not yet reached and might never reach. The three realms, sky, sea, and underworld, were not separate from one another in the ancient understanding. They were the three dimensions of a single cosmos, the vertical axis of the world running from the etheric light of Olympus's summit, through the warm mortal air of the surface world, through the cold and lightless depths of the sea, through the cave mouths and river crossings of the underworld, down to the absolute darkness and cold of Tartarus at the foundation of everything. Each realm was defined by its relationship to light and warmth, Olympus possessing both in their most concentrated and perfect form, the mortal world possessing both in their ordinary, impermanent, seasonal form, the underworld possessing neither, and Tartarus existing as the negation of both, the place where the absence of light and warmth was not a condition, but a substance, not a lack, but a presence. And between these realms, the mortal world went about its business, planting and harvesting, building and destroying, sailing the wine-dark sea between islands whose names were known and whose harbours were familiar, looking up at the sky for signs of divine intention and down at the earth for signs of divine favour, aware at every moment that the world they inhabited was the middle layer of a cosmos whose upper and lower reaches were governed by presences of incomprehensible power, whose decisions shaped the weather and the harvest and the outcome of wars and the fate of individuals with the same impersonal authority that the sea shapes the coastline, not with cruelty. That the sea shapes the coastline, not with cruelty, not with kindness, but with the absolute, patient, inhuman force of things that have been what they are, since before the world had a name. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs only to places where something extraordinary has recently happened, or is about to happen, and the Greek world of the heroic age was saturated with it. Not the silence of emptiness or abandonment, but the silence of a landscape holding its breath, of terrain that has been altered by the presence of the extraordinary, and carries that alteration in every detail of its surface. The heroic age, which Hesiod identified as the fourth of his 5 ages of man, was the age in which the Greek world became a landscape populated by the impossible, a geography in which every mountain pass and coastal marsh and island shore might conceal something that defied the ordinary categories of the living world. Beneath the palace complex of Knossos on the island of Crete, the labyrinth that ancient tradition attributed to the craft of Daedalus existed as an architectural environment, unlike anything else in the known world. Its walls were of dressed stone, cut and fitted with the precision of a mind that understood geometry as a weapon rather than a tool, each corridor leading not toward a destination but away from one, each junction offering choices that were not choices, because all paths within the labyrinth were equivalent in their ultimate futility. The stone pressed close on both sides, the passages narrow enough that the walls were always within reach, their surfaces cold and slightly damp with the moisture that rose from the deep earth below, carrying on their faces the marks of the tools that had shaped them and the faint mineral smell of cut limestone that had never been exposed to open air. The air within the labyrinth was stale in a way that ordinary enclosed spaces are not stale. It was the air of a place that had been sealed for a long time, that had been breathed and rebreathed by something that was not human, and whose exhalations had left a quality in the atmosphere that no subsequent ventilation had been able to remove, a smell that was ancient and animal, and carried within it something that the body recognized before the mind could name it, something that activated the oldest and most reliable of the body's warning systems. The darkness of the labyrinth was not uniform. It varied from passage to passage, from junction to junction, in ways that had no apparent relationship to the architecture, some corridors holding a faint luminosity, whose source was impossible to identify, others descending into a darkness so complete that the walls could only be found by touch, the geometry of the space becoming purely tactile, purely immediate. The mind stripped of its usual reliance on the visual field and left with only the information that the fingertips could provide. The geometry of the labyrinth was designed to disorient and entrap through the systematic destruction of the spatial intuitions that allow a mind to build a map of an environment. Passages that appeared to run straight curved imperceptibly over long distances, arriving at positions that bore no relationship to where the mind calculated they should be. Descents that seemed gradual accumulated into depths far greater than the body's sense of elevation could account for. The sound within the labyrinth moved in ways that stone corridors should not permit. Echoes arriving from directions that contained no wall to produce them. The sound of water running somewhere in the deep stone without any visible source, and occasionally from somewhere in the darkness that was always further away than it seemed. A sound that was not water and not stone, and not the movement of air through passages. A sound that the ancient tradition preserved in the name of the creature that inhabited this place. The Nemean plain in the northeastern Peloponnese carried the presence of its most famous inhabitant in every detail of its landscape, long before any traveller came close enough to see the creature itself. The silence was the first indicator, the particular silence of a landscape, from which the ordinary sounds of living things had been removed, not gradually, but completely, as though something had passed through the ecosystem of the plain and extracted from it every creature below a certain size, leaving behind only the wind in the grass and the occasional sound of stone shifting in the heat. The birdsong that should have filled the scrubland at the edges of the plain was absent. Not diminished, not reduced to the calls of larger, older species, but simply gone. The acoustic environment of the plain stripped of the layer of small, continuous sound that marks a living landscape and replaced with a quiet that was more oppressive than noise. The grass of the Nemean plain was trampled in wide circles around the cave mouth that served as the lion's den, not the random trampling of a grazing animal moving through its territory, but the systematic destruction of the ground cover by repeated circular movement, the soil beneath compacted to the hardness of stone by the weight of something enormous moving over it, again and again. At the cave entrance itself, the bleached bones of prey animals were arranged not by any deliberate intelligence, but by the simple accumulation of what had been dragged there and consumed. The white of old bone catching the sunlight, with a brightness that stood in stark contrast to the dark mouth of the cave behind them. The entrance to the den a threshold between the light of the plain and a darkness that smelled of old blood, and the particular dry animal smell of a large predator's home. The smaller animals that should have inhabited the margins of the plain, the hares and foxes and small deer of the Greek countryside, were simply not present. Their absence was as legible as their presence would have been, a negative space in the landscape that described the shape of the fear that had emptied it. The Lernaean marsh in the eastern Argolid was an environment of grey water and grey sky and the particular smell of standing water that has been still for a long time, the smell of anaerobic decomposition, of organic matter breaking down in the absence of oxygen, of the deep mud of a marsh that has accumulated centuries of fallen vegetation and the remains of everything that has died within it. The reeds that grew at the margins of the open water moved without wind, a slow, continuous movement that had no meteorological explanation, a stirring in the stems and leaves that suggested the passage of something through the water beneath them, something that moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a creature that has no predators and therefore no reason to conceal its movement. The surface of the water itself was broken at irregular intervals by something rising from below and submerging again, not the clean break of a fish or a diving bird, but a slow, heavy disturbance that displaced the surface in a wide circle, the water closing over the disturbance with a reluctance that suggested the thing causing it was very large and very close to the surface, even when not visible. The mist that lay over the Lernaean marsh was not the ordinary morning mist of low-lying ground. It was denser and more persistent, present at midday, when the sun should have burned it away, carrying within it a quality of the marsh's atmosphere, the smell of standing water, and the particular cold of a place that the sun's warmth never fully penetrated. Within this mist, the multiple heads of the hydra were not visible as discrete shapes, but as disturbances in the fog, movements that suggested scale, without revealing it, the mist thickening and thinning around something that moved through it, without displacing it, the way a very large object moves through water without creating a wave, its mass too great, and its movement too slow to produce the turbulence that smaller, faster things create. The Augean stables, by contrast, were an environment of overwhelming disorder on a scale that transformed the concept of disorder itself into something approaching the cosmic. The stables of King Augeas housed, according to ancient tradition, a divine herd of cattle whose number ancient sources place in the thousands, and the accumulation of what those thousands of animals produced over the years of the stable's neglect had created a landscape that was not merely dirty, but fundamentally altered. The original architecture of the stables buried beneath a depth of accumulated matter that had its own topography, its own drainage patterns, its own ecology of organisms that thrived in conditions that nothing else could tolerate. The smell of the place was not a smell in the ordinary sense. It was an atmospheric condition, a quality of the air that was present, not just within the stables, but across the surrounding landscape, carried on the wind to distances that made the stables themselves invisible, announcing their existence to anyone within range of the prevailing breeze, long before the structures came into view. The transformation of this environment by the redirection of the rivers Alpheus and Peneus was an event that the landscape registered as a sudden total reversal of its accumulated condition. The water arrived not as a gradual increase in flow, but as a directed force. The rivers diverted from their channels and sent through the stables with the full volume of their current, the moving water encountering the accumulated matter of years and years of neglect and carrying it away with the impersonal efficiency of a geological process. The sound of the water moving through the stables was the sound of a river in flood, the deep, continuous roar of moving water carrying a heavy sediment load, the percussion of larger objects being moved by the current, the hiss of water finding new paths through the material it was displacing. And then, as the water moved through and the landscape behind it was revealed, a quality of cleanliness that was almost shocking in its contrast. The pale stone of the original floor emerging from beneath the accumulated matter, the air above it suddenly carrying the smell of moving water rather than the smell of what had been there before. At the western edge of the world, beyond the limits of the Orcumenae, and past the pillars that marked the boundary of the navigable sea, the Garden of the Hesperides existed as an environment of extraordinary golden light. The air there was heavy with the smell of ripening fruit, not the sharp green smell of fruit not yet ready, nor the oversweet smell of fruit past its peak, but the precise, perfect smell of fruit at the exact moment of its fullest ripeness, a smell that carried within it the concentrated essence of the tree and the soil and the light that had produced it. The trees themselves were heavy with golden apples that caught the last light of the setting sun, and at the western edge of the world the sun was always setting, always at that particular angle that turns gold to fire, and fire to something that has no name in any language. The light of the garden, therefore, always at its most intense, always at the moment of its most extraordinary beauty. The presence of Ladon, the ancient serpent who guarded the garden, was felt as a vibration in the air, rather than seen directly. The coils of the creature moved through the two, grass at the base of the apple trees with a slowness that was itself a kind of power, not the quick, reactive movement of a creature that startles, but the deliberate, unhurried movement of something that has been in this place since before the garden was planted, that knows every inch of the ground it moves through, that does not need to hurry, because nothing in this place has ever successfully evaded it. The sound of its movement was the sound of scales on grass, a dry, continuous whisper that was present throughout the garden as a kind of ambient sound, the way the sound of wind in leaves is present throughout a forest, sourceless and omnidirectional, a reminder that the garden's beauty existed within the context of its guardian. The sea routes of the heroic age were a landscape of islands and straits and hidden dangers whose geography was as much mythological as cartographic. The Aegean presented to those who sailed it a world of extraordinary visual complexity. The islands rising from the water at every scale, from the great masses of Crete and Euboea to the small, unnamed rocks that broke the surface just enough to threaten a hull, the water between them shifting in color and depth and current as the bottom rose and fell beneath. The straits between islands created accelerations of current that the ancient sailors knew and named and navigated by, the water moving through a narrow passage with a speed and force that the open sea did not prepare the traveler for, the surface of the strait turbulent and unpredictable, the sound of the water against the hull changing from the deep, slow percussion of open water sailing to the sharp, urgent sound of water under pressure. The simpler gades, the clashing rocks at the entrance to the Euxine Sea, were an environmental phenomenon that the ancient tradition described in terms that transformed geology into something approaching the animate. The rocks moved, according to the sources, crushing between them anything that attempted to pass, and the environment of their location was defined by the evidence of this movement. The churning water between them perpetually white with the turbulence of their collision, the sound of stone against stone, carried across the water as a deep, percussive impact that arrived before the movement was visible. The spray thrown up by the displaced water catching the light in brief, brilliant arcs before falling back into the chaos of the strait. The air around the Symplegades carried the cold of the deep water that the rocks displaced, and the smell of the sea was stronger there than anywhere else on the route. The salt and cold and mineral sharpness of water that had been violently disturbed, the atmosphere of the place, defined by the energy of the geological event at its center. The island of the Sirens was known not by the presence of something visible, but by the quality of its silence. Sailors approaching it from a distance would have noticed first the absence of the ordinary sounds of the sea, the wind and the water, and the creak of the hull, replaced by a silence that was not empty but full, a silence that contained within it a music that seemed to come from the rocks themselves, rather than from any identifiable source. The music was sourceless in the way that the sound of the labyrinth was sourceless. Present, everywhere and nowhere, arriving from all directions simultaneously, its origin impossible to locate, because it was not a sound traveling through air from a point of origin, but a quality of the air itself, as though the atmosphere around the island had been tuned to a frequency that bypassed the ordinary mechanisms of hearing and went directly to whatever part of the mind responds to beauty before the part of the mind responds to beauty. Mind has had time to evaluate it. The bones on the shore of the Sirens' Island were the landscape's honest record of what the music had accomplished. They lay in the same arrangement as the bones at the Nemean cave mouth, the accumulation of what had been drawn there and had not returned. But where the Nemean bones spoke of predation, of something that hunted and consumed, the bones of the Siren's shore spoke of a different kind of ending, one that the landscape registered with a quality of melancholy rather than violence. The shore itself was beautiful, the stone pale and smooth, the water clear and the color of deep sky, the air carrying the sourceless music and the smell of the sea, and the beauty of the place was inseparable from its danger, the two qualities so thoroughly intertwined that to experience one was to be in the presence of the other. The heroic landscape of ancient Greece was, in its deepest nature, a landscape of thresholds. Every environment that the great mythological cycles moved through was a place where the ordinary and the extraordinary existed in immediate proximity, where the familiar geography of the Mediterranean world, its islands and marshes and plains and sea routes, had been transformed by the presence of something that did not belong to the ordinary categories of the living world and had left the evidence of its presence in the silence and the smell and the quality of the light. The heroes who moved through this landscape are not the subject of this account, but the landscape itself, shaped by their encounters and by the creatures and forces they confronted, carries within every detail of its surface the record of what passed through it, the way stone carries the record of the water that shaped it, patient and permanent, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone is present to read what it has preserved. There are places on the surface of the earth where the ground itself seems to know something that the surrounding landscape does not. Not places distinguished by extraordinary beauty, necessarily, or by dramatic geology, or by the practical advantages that draw human settlement, fresh water, defensible terrain, fertile soil. place is distinguished instead by a quality of the atmosphere that resists ordinary description, a charge in the air that is not quite temperature and not quite smell, but something older than either, something that the body registers before the mind has formed the question of what it is registering. The ancient Greeks were among the most systematic and most reverent readers of this quality in the landscape, and the sacred geography they built upon these readings was one of the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world. A network of sanctuaries and oracles and temples distributed across the Greek world in patterns that the ancient sources suggest were not accidental. That reflected an understanding of the Earth's surface as a document written in the language of divine presence. Delphi announces itself long before the sanctuary comes into view. The approach through the mountain terrain of Phocis is an approach through a landscape that grows progressively more concentrated, more deliberate, as though the geography were organizing itself around a point that the traveler has not yet reached. The road climbs through terrain of extraordinary drama. The slopes of Parnassus rising on one side, the deep gorge of the Pleistos Valley falling away on the other, a whole landscape arranged in a vertical geometry that forces the eye upward and inward simultaneously, toward the cliffs that become visible as the sanctuary approaches. These are the Phaedriades, the shining rocks, twin cliffs of pale limestone that rise above the sanctuary of Apollo, with a verticality that the surrounding terrain does nothing to prepare the traveller for, their faces catching the Mediterranean sun and returning it with an intensity that makes them seem to generate their own light rather than merely to reflect what falls upon them. The quality of light at Delphi is unlike the quality of light anywhere else in the Greek world. Phaedriades create a microenvironment of reflected and concentrated illumination, the pale limestone faces bouncing the sun's light downward and inward toward the sanctuary below, in a way that makes the air above the temple precincts seem more saturated, more golden, more present than the air of the surrounding slopes. Ancient visitors to Delphi recorded this quality without being able to explain it. The sense that the sun struck differently here, that the light arrived from multiple directions simultaneously, that the shadows fell at angles that did not correspond to the position of the sun in the sky. The effect was not dramatic in the way that a storm is dramatic or a volcanic eruption is dramatic. It was subtle and persistent and cumulative, a quality that grew on the visitor over time, that was more noticeable after an hour in the sanctuary than after a moment. That seemed to deepen rather than diminish with continued exposure. The smell of Delphi was the smell of laurel, the sacred plant of Apollo, growing in dense stands throughout the sanctuary precinct, its leaves releasing their sharp, resinous fragrance in the heat of the afternoon sun. Laurel has a smell that is simultaneously clean and complex, carrying within it something of the Mediterranean hillside and something of the kitchen and something of the sacred, a smell that the ancient tradition associated with purification and with the presence of the divine. Mixed with the laurel was something else, a sulphurous quality in the air that rose from the chasm beneath the temple of Apollo, the geological feature that ancient tradition identified as the source of the Pythia's prophetic inspiration. The sulfur was not overwhelming, not the choking exhalation of a volcanic vent, but a thread of mineral sharpness woven through the laurel fragrance, a reminder that beneath the beautiful surface of the sanctuary, the earth was doing something that the surface world could only partially comprehend. The temple of Apollo at Delphi stood at the center of the sanctuary precinct, on a terrace cut into the steep slope of Parnassus. Its Doric columns of Parnassus, local limestone rising against the backdrop of the Phaedriades, with a relationship between architecture and geology that seemed less like a building placed in a landscape and more like a landscape and more like a landscape that had organized itself into a building. The proportions of the temple were the proportions of the Doric order at its most confident. The columns massive and slightly tapered, their capitals simple and strong. And strong, the entablature above them, carrying the weight of the pediment with the quiet authority of stone that knows exactly how much it can bear. The interior of the temple was cool, even in the heat of the Greek summer, the thick walls of limestone, maintaining a temperature that the outside air could not penetrate, the darkness within a deliberate contrast to the extraordinary light of the precinct outside. The Adyton, the innermost chamber of the temple, where the Pythia received her divine inspiration, was an environment of concentrated sensory intensity. Ancient sources, including the geographer Strabo and the biographer Plutarch, describe the chamber as a small, low-ceilinged space set into the bedrock of the mountain, its floor directly above the chasm from which the pneuma, the divine breath, was believed to rise. The darkness of the Adyton was the darkness of deep enclosed stone, a darkness that the small oil lamps placed within it barely disturbed, their flames creating pools of amber light that illuminated the immediate surfaces and left everything beyond them in a shadow that was not merely dark but textured, layered, carrying within it the quality of the deep earth below. The cold of the chamber was the cold of the chamber, Mountains interior, the same sourceless mineral cold that characterized the cave mouths of the underworld in the mythological tradition, a cold that rose through the stone floor and was present in the walls and seemed to emanate from the darkness itself rather than from any identifiable source of low temperature. The Pythia, seated on her tripod above the chasm, existed within this environment as a threshold figure, a mortal body in a space that the ancient tradition understood as the point of closest proximity between the human world and the divine. The laurel she chewed, the water she drank from the sacred spring of Cassotis, the smoke of the burning laurel and barley meal that filled the chamber. These were the sensory conditions of the prophetic state, the environmental triggers that the tradition had developed over centuries of practice to facilitate the crossing of the boundary between ordinary consciousness and the state in which divine knowledge became accessible. The questions brought to Delphi by kings and city-states and individuals arrived at this chamber from the entire Greek world and beyond, carried through the extraordinary landscape of the approach and the concentrated atmosphere of the sanctuary precinct to this small, dark, cold, sulfur-scented space where the earth breathed upward through the stone and the Pythia breathed it in. Olympia, in the western Peloponnese, was a sacred landscape of an entirely different character. Where Delphi was vertical, all cliff face and mountain slope, and the drama of geology asserting itself against the sky. Olympia was horizontal, a broad, flat valley where the rivers Alpheus and Cladius met in there, a confluence that the ancient tradition understood as itself a sacred event, the meeting of waters in a landscape of extraordinary fertility and calm. The Altis, the sacred grove of Zeus that formed the heart of the sanctuary, was a landscape of ancient trees whose canopy created an interior atmosphere quite different from the open sky above the surrounding plain, the light filtering through the leaves in the amber and gold of a forest interior, the air cooler and more humid than the air of the valley, carrying the smell of old wood and leaf mold, and the particular freshness of a place where water is close to the surface. The great temple of Zeus at Olympia, completed in the 5th century before the Common Era, and housing the chryselephantine statue created by Pydias, was an environment in which the relationship between architecture and the divine presence it was built to contain was expressed through the manipulation of light. The exterior of the temple was the Doric order at its most massive. Columns of local shell limestone coated in white stucco, their proportions heavier and more powerful than the Athenian Doric of the same period, the whole structure expressing the authority of Zeus through sheer physical weight rather than through refinement or elegance. The interior was a different world entirely. The statue of Zeus occupied the full height of the cella, its gold and ivory surfaces catching and multiplying the lamplight until the interior of the temple seemed to breathe with its own illumination. The gold of the drapery and the throne reflecting the flames of the oil lamps in warm, shifting patterns across the ceiling and walls, the ivory of the skin glowing with a close, a ceiling and walls, the ivory of the skin glowing with a quality that was neither the glow of living flesh nor the glow of carved material, but something between the two, something that the ancient sources described as the presence of the divine made visible through the medium of the craftsman's art. The ancient traveller Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, recorded that the statue of Zeus at Olympia was so overwhelming in its scale and its quality that those who entered the temple and stood before it felt that something had been added to theirs to experience of the divine, that the image was not merely a representation of Zeus, but a concentration of his presence, a point in the physical world where the god was more immediately available than he was elsewhere. The quality of light inside the temple contributed to this effect. The way the gold caught the lamplight and returned it, multiplied and returned it, multiplied. The way the ivory seemed to absorb the light and release it slowly. The way the shadows in the upper reaches of the cellar moved with the movement of the flames and gave the enormous figure above a quality of animation that the stillness of the carved material should not have permitted. The sanctuary of Eleusis, on the coast of Attica west of Athens, was a sacred landscape organized around the principle of the threshold, the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the living and the dead, between the world of ordinary experience and the world of divine revelation. The approach to Eleusis along the sacred way, from Athens was itself a ritual journey, the road passing through a landscape that grew progressively more charged with sacred significance as the sanctuary approached. The shrines and stopping points along the route marking a gradual transition from the ordinary world of the city to the extraordinary world of the mysteries. The plain of Eleusis was a landscape of grain, the agricultural abundance that Demeter's myth explained and sanctified. The smell of growing wheat and barley present in the air of the plain at every season. The fertility of the soil, a constant sensory reminder of the divine gift that the sanctuary existed to honor. The Telesterion, the great hall of initiation at the heart of the Eleusinian sanctuary, was an architectural environment unlike any other sacred building in the Greek world. Where the great temples of the Olympian gods were designed to be seen from outside, their colonnaded exteriors the primary architectural statement and their interiors relatively small and inaccessible. The Telesterion was designed entirely around the interior experience. Hypostyle hall, capable of holding thousands of initiates simultaneously, its roof supported by a forest of columns that created an interior landscape of repeated vertical forms receding into the darkness at the edges of the space. The darkness of the Telesterion was the primary condition of the initiation. The hall kept in near total darkness for the first part of the ceremony, the initiates standing in a blackness that was disorienting in its completeness, stripped of the visual information that the mind ordinarily uses to locate itself in space. And then the light, sudden, overwhelming, arriving without preparation from the Anactoron, the small inner chamber at the center of the Telesterion, where the Hierophant performed the central act of the mysteries. Ancient sources, bound by their oaths of secrecy, to describe the experience only in the most oblique terms, nevertheless convey the quality of this moment with a consistency that suggests it was the defining experience of the initiation, a light that arrived in the darkness with the force of a revelation that transformed the quality of the space and the quality of the space and the quality of the initiate's experience of themselves within it. That was understood not as a theatrical effect, but as the actual presence of the divine breaking through the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of Persephone and Demeter. The smell of grain and earth and fire that filled the Telesterion in the moments of revelation was the smell of the agricultural world made sacred, the ordinary smell of the Eleusinian plain, concentrated and transformed by the context of the ceremony into something that carried within it the entire weight of the myth it was enacting. The island of Delos, at the center of the Cyclades, in the middle of the Aegean, was the most sacred island in the Greek world. The birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, the floating island that had been fixed in place by divine decree to provide a stable ground for the birth of the twin gods. The sacredness of Delos was registered in the quality of its atmosphere, in ways that ancient visitors consistently noted. The air above the island described as permanently different from the air above any other island in the Aegean, cleaner and more still, carrying a quality of deliberateness that the surrounding sea air did not possess. The light over Delos was described as cleaner than the light over other islands, not brighter, not warmer, but more precise, more prose, direct, arriving without the diffusion that the sea air ordinarily imposed on Mediterranean sunlight as though the island's sacred status had earned it a more immediate relationship with the sun whose god had been born upon it. The silence of Delos was the silence of a place that had been consecrated by divine birth and maintained in that consecration by centuries of ritual prohibition. No one was permitted to be born on Delos, and no one was permitted to die there. The island preserved from the biological processes of beginning and ending that defined mortal existence. Its sacred status maintained through the exclusion of the very events that most clearly marked the boundary between the divine and the human. The sanctuary of Apollo on the island's western shore was a landscape of white marble and the blue of the Aegean seen between the columns of the temple portico, a visual environment of extraordinary clarity. The pale stone and the deep water and the clean light of the sacred island combining into an image that the ancient world understood as the closest available approximation to the visual quality of the visual quality, divine realm itself. The oracle at Dona, in the mountains of Epirus in northwestern Greece, was among the oldest sacred sites in the Greek world. Older, ancient tradition suggested than Delphi, its methods of divination, rooted in a time before the elaborate ceremonial apparatus of the Apolline oracle had been developed. At Dodona, the divine voice spoke through the rustling of the leaves of a sacred oak tree, through the sound of bronze vessels struck by the wind, through the cooing of sacred doves in the branches above the sanctuary. Time be called 900 milliseconds. The environment of Dodona was an environment of sound rather than of light or smell. The mountain air carrying the voices of the trees and the vessels and the birds in a continuous, sourceless music that the priests and priestesses of the sanctuary had learned to read as the speech of Zeus himself, the oldest of the gods, communicating through the oldest of the natural world's voices. Against the vast backdrop of these great sanctuaries, Delphi, with its extraordinary geology and its sulphurous breath and its concentrated light, Olympia with its sacred grove and its overwhelming golden interior, Eleusis with its darkness and its sudden revelation, Delos with its clean air and its sacred silence. The domestic sacred existed at a scale that was intimate and immediate and no less genuine for its smallness. In every household of the ancient Greek world, a small shrine occupied a corner of the main room or a niche in the wall near the entrance, a space defined by the presence of a clay lamp and the painted image and the small vessels that held the offerings of daily devotion. The smell of this space was the smell of olive oil burning in the lamp, a warm, slightly fatty smell that was the ambient smell of the ancient Greek interior, present in every room of every house, but concentrated here at the household shrine into something that was both ordinary and sacred simultaneously. The smell of daily life made deliberate, made intentional, made an act of acknowledgement toward the divine powers that the great sanctuaries honored at cosmic scale. The light of the single clay lamp before the household image was the light of Delphi reduced to its most essential form, a prote, small flame in a domestic darkness, casting its amber glow on the painted face of a deity whose full presence was housed in the great temples of the sanctuary cities, but whose attention, the ancient tradition insisted, was no less available to the individual in the low-ceilinged room than to the king consulting the Pythia in the sulphurous darkness of the Editon. The incense that burned before the household shrine carried the same sacred fragrance that rose from the great altars of the Olympian sanctuaries, scaled down to the dimensions of a single room, a single family, a single moment of private devotion in the long, continuous conversation between the mortal world and the divine that the sacred geography of ancient Greece had been built to facilitate and to honor. The cosmos that had emerged from chaos, that had been shaped by the violence of the Titanarchy and organized by the authority of Olympus, that expressed itself in the vast environments of sea and underworld and heroic landscape, that same cosmos was present in the small flame, in the painted image, in the smell of olive oil and incense, in the quiet of a domestic evening, the intimate scale of private devotion, the final, most human expression of a sacred geography that stretched from the summit of Olympus to the floor of the deepest sea. The places where heaven touched earth were not only the dramatic places, not only the cliff-face sanctuary of the oracle or the gold-filled interior of the great temple. They were everywhere, that a human being paused in the ordinary movement of a day and turned attention, however briefly, toward the powers that the ancient Greek tradition understood as the foundation of everything, the powers that had emerged from chaos before the world had a name, that had shaped the landscape through ages of divine conflict and divine governance, that were present in the quality of the light at Delphi and the silence at Delos, and the sudden illumination in the darkness of the Telesterion, and equally present in the small amber flame burning before a clay image in a low-ceilinged room at the end of an ordinary day.